anti-nuclear campaigners in Britain fear that all these weapons around in Europe could precipitate an accidental nuclear conflict. How worried are you about that?
Well, there is a possibility of an accident, and I think one must recognize that. But if there is a belief that unless those weapons are deployed, you cannot depend on the U.S., then I'm in favor of deploying them.
Mr. McNamara, in your view, is the arms race a costly irrelevance?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last question. Is the arms race what?
Is it a costly irrelevance?
I still can't hear the last two words.
Is the arms race, in your view, a costly irrelevance?
It's certainly not irrelevant. I think that it's being carried on, and the negotiations in particular that are designed to dampen down the arms race are being carried on by the West on false premises. And I've suggested in a recent article in Foreign Affairs that one cannot properly address the questions that one must address in arms negotiations without having a clear view of the military role of nuclear weapons, a view which I believe at present is erroneous. I believe that NATO must revise its strategy, recognize that there is no military role whatsoever for nuclear weapons other than deterring one's opponent's first use of nuclear weapons before we can engage in serious arms talks that will ultimately lead to a substantial reduction in the numbers of weapons and a reduction in the risk of use of those weapons.
Where does that, in your view, then, leave the possible deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe?
Well, I had hoped we could avoid discussing that because I doubt that one can come to agreement on deployment of Pershing and Cruise missiles until one really comes to agreement on the military role of those weapons. But let me jump ahead and say that I have heard European political leaders, for example, an ex-prime minister of a very major country, state that in their opinion there is no military requirement for either the Pershing missiles or the cruise missiles in Europe. That is a position that I very much support. However, these same European political leaders have gone on to say that although there is no military requirement, there is a political requirement. There is a need for the United States to build confidence in the minds of the Europeans that we will protect them with our nuclear weapons, that we will come to their defense with our nuclear weapons, that confidence can only be engendered by deploying the Pershings and the cruises in Europe. If that's the case, then I'm in favor of it. Until such time as we can come to our senses and recognize what these political leaders are saying, there is no military requirement. There shouldn't be any political requirement if there's no military requirement. But if there is a belief, even though it's an erroneous belief, that unless those weapons are deployed, you cannot depend on the U.S., then I'm in favor of deploying them.
But where does that leave the Soviet Union? What you say seems to be very close to the argument that the Soviets have used, that there's really no necessity in the balance, in the equation, if you like, for these weapons to be deployed.
Well, what I've said with respect to the Pershings and the cruises applies equally well to deployment of the SS-20s. There is no military requirement for the Soviets to deploy them. They have deployed them, I think, through misjudgment, but they have. It would be in their interest and our interest for them to withdraw the SS-20s and for us to defer deployment of the Pershings and cruises. So long as they don't withdraw the SS-20s, and so long as the Europeans believe that unless we deploy Pershings and cruises, we cannot be depended upon to come to their defense, I'm in favor of deploying them. But we should correct that misperception as promptly as we can over the next year or two or three.
Some of the anti-nuclear campaigners in Britain fear what I believe to be one of your concerns, that all these weapons around in Europe, as they can be anywhere else, could probably precipitate the possibility of an accidental nuclear conflict. How worried are you about that?
Well, there is a possibility of an accident, and I think one must recognize that. And for that reason, I have put forward not only a suggestion that we adopt a strategy of no first use, but I've suggested that we adopt a strategy of no second use until we know what has happened and how we should respond in our own interest. In other words, there should be no launch on warning, which unfortunately the Soviets are beginning to talk about, and which is a very, very dangerous proposition.
Mr. McNamara, you are a former defense secretary. I wonder whether I could ask you something more general. Does the shooting down of the Korean plane recently tell us anything new about Soviet attitudes?
Well, that incident occurred after I had submitted my article for publication, but it dramatically illustrated the danger of the nuclear age. What it told us is not just something about Soviet attitudes, it tells us something about the danger of misunderstandings and mistakes. In that case, a tragic misunderstanding that caused the death of 269 civilians. But as tragic as that is, it doesn't begin to compare with the catastrophe that would result if we had a misunderstanding, a misjudgment of the same kind with respect to possible use of nuclear weapons. And what you have evidence of is rigid Soviet procedures, automatic responses, the possibility of errors of judgments, and then the mobilization of the bureaucracy to support the misjudgment and the error that is made. Now that is the formula for catastrophe if it were ever to be applied in a situation that involved possible use of nuclear weapons, as it well might be under present circumstances.
From what you understand to be the position of the current American administration, are we talking about trying to treat with the Soviets, or are we more concerned about confronting them with superior military might?
Well, I think the current administration wishes to do both. It wishes to, what they consider is necessary, redress an imbalance. I don't agree with their assessment of the current balance. The West is much stronger than the administration has indicated. But in any event, while they are redressing what they consider an imbalance, they also plan to negotiate. I strongly support that position. I wish them success. I hope they'll be willing to modify their formulae more than they've presently indicated. And I very much hope we can come to an agreement with the Soviets, both with respect to the intermediate range nuclear weapons for Europe and with respect to the strategic weapons as well.
You, sir, were in the Kennedy administration during America's involvement in Vietnam. Do you wonder, when you read about current events in Lebanon, whether the Americans are again getting involved in a conflict which could escalate way beyond what they planned?
Well, there's always the danger of escalation, but I don't think there's any real analogy between Vietnam and Lebanon.
Mr. McNamara, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Shirley.